Part 1. Pong and Perfection. Pong is a game that I would consider to be perfect. I'm not able to discern any flaws in it. Now, while the original Pong certainly had its faults, subsequent versions do not have these same issues. In the newer versions at least, the paddles move at just the right speed to encourage skill and control, making it easy to move around while still maintaining a skill gap. The ball speed is just as good and complements the speed of the paddles nicely. The size of the paddles are just as suitable as everything else. The sound effects are nice on the ears and clearly define what is happening on screen. And finally, the ball bounces very predictably, making it easy for the players to determine where the ball will be. Despite all this, I would not call Pong the greatest game of all time, and I highly doubt that anyone else seriously into video games would either. Even though Pong is seemingly perfect, there appears to be something about it that keeps it out of discussion from being one of the best. The issue with Pong is that there is nothing inherently interesting about perfection. It's not often perfection itself that we find impressive or engrossing. Perfection is simply a consequence of executing everything to such a degree that there are no faults. It is what the execution has to work with that we find interesting, not how well that idea was executed upon. So if perfection only describes execution, then logically it cannot be the most fundamental aspect determining quality, and thusly its true value may be brought into question. Getting right down to it, it's the ideas that intrigue us the most. They're what truly gets us emotionally connected to the work we are consuming. I'm sure we can all think of things that we know are flawed, but we love regardless. Sometimes we love them because they are flawed. These are the ideas behind the work that we are appreciating. Perfection is not interesting on its own because it is rather easy to pull off if the idea is simplistic enough. It is the conjunction of great ideas and good execution that truly produces something remarkable. Perfection of a dull idea does not entice us any more than imperfection of a dull idea. At the end of the day, the idea was not a good one, so there was little potential for quality regardless of the execution. In either scenario, it is not enjoyable for the consumer of the work, and that's all that really matters. It is what surrounds perfection that creates a good experience, and those two things should not be conflated with one another. Pong was great for its time, but we've come a long way since then in both technology and in game design. The number of ideas that we've been able to implement into games has increased to an insane degree in the past 4 decades, and it definitely shows. And that is why Pong is not seriously discussed as among the greats of the medium. Newer games are able to bring so much more to the table and offer much more engaging, enjoyable experiences by utilizing more modern knowledge and technology. Pong was only able to be so good given its simplicity, even if it was able to execute perfectly on the ideas it did have. A few ideas Pong did have, I would argue, are good ones, and that is why Pong succeeds as a game, and is fun and enjoyable to play even to this day. But a few good ideas cannot hope to match the potential of what we are capable of now. It's important to remember that the number of ideas is not simply the determining factor in the quality of a game either. The importance of good execution of these ideas should not be downplayed, for a game could be better for not having an idea at all if the idea was not executed on well. The quality of the idea should not be discounted either, as quality is often more important than quantity. In that sense, adding new things and ideas to a game is really a risk. The more ideas, the more potential to be better, but also to be worse. High risk, high reward. For instance, Pong, with its little number of ideas, could only be so good or so bad. We know what Pong is at its best, since that's the version of the game we got, and at worst, Pong would most likely be forgettable and simply given the label bad. I don't see a way in which Pong could be offensively bad or dreadful to play, which are experiences I'm sure everyone has had at least a couple of times in their gaming career. Pong is a good, fun game that was remarkable for its time, and I hope you can all agree with me on that. If this were still the 70s, I think Pong would have a good case for being one of, if not the greatest game of all time. But we have made staggering progress since then, and so I don't think Pong has much of a case anymore. Due to the improvements in technology and game design, we've been able to expand the number and scale of ideas in our games and thusly raise their potential above that of what Pong was capable of. Inevitably, many games have been able to achieve this potential to a satisfying degree, which pushes them over the perfection of Pong. And so, Pong has inevitably been surpassed despite its perfection as a game. Advancement in technology, which has allowed for an increased number of ideas to be implemented into our games and which implies a high-risk, high-reward design structure, seems to have trumped perfection. The problem with perfection has made itself apparent. Achievement of it is an indication of limited quality. Part 2. Risk-taking in Shadow of the Colossus. In contrast to Pong, Shadow of the Colossus is not a perfect game. In fact, it is quite a ways away from being one. Shadow of the Colossus, however, I would argue, is one of those examples in which its potential is achieved to a degree that its overall quality exceeds that of Pong. In other words, let's say that I value the overall potential of Shadow of the Colossus to be at 200, and Pong's at 100. Completely arbitrary numbers. I wouldn't even say that Shadow of the Colossus has the potential to be twice as good. I don't know. And let's say that I think that Shadow of the Colossus is able to achieve 75% of that potential, while Pong achieves 100%, because, in fact, it is a perfect game. Again, arbitrary. In my mind, I would evaluate Shadow of the Colossus to have a quality rating of 150, while Pong's would be at 100. This would make Shadow of the Colossus the better game in theory, which I believe to be true. So what is it that Shadow of the Colossus does exactly that makes me believe it to be a better game than one I would call perfect? Conveniently, we've already answered this question. It has to be the number and quality of ideas that separates it from Pong, as the execution of those ideas certainly cannot be the answer. The real questions then are, what does that mean, and how did Shadow of the Colossus manage to pull that off? The number of ideas something has is an easy concept to comprehend. More things are going on and being explored, so there are more ideas. Simple. Although it may not seem as all-encompassing as it really is at first glance. For instance, in Shadow of the Colossus, having a colossi in the game is clearly an idea, but so is Wonder's progression of deterioration, a much smaller detail in the game. No matter how large or small a new concept added to the work may be, it's an idea, which means that anything from a mechanic to a plot point to a level is an idea. This would seem to suggest that the longer a work is, the more ideas it would have, but that's not always the case. The density of ideas and the depth in which concepts are explored are two very important aspects. An example of this being the difference between a sitcom and an epic drama. Sitcoms will operate on a few basic ideas in contrast to epic dramas, and then work with those ideas in an attempt to create something enjoyable. Maybe an easier way to view this is to take a look at the granddad of all sitcoms, Seinfeld. Seinfeld in actuality operates on only a few number of ideas. It presents a few ideas for each character, constructing their personalities and mannerisms, and a few more that are allocated to fleshing out the group dynamic. These ideas help to build a lot of the general tone of the show. The rest of the show's ideas are found in the episode-to-episode, which tend to be rather general in nature, nothing too in-depth, much more simple. The majority of effort went into writing in contrast to the ideas that I've been harping on so far. Seinfeld is able to get away with introducing only a few ideas per episode by playing around with how these characters would react to that situation in a mostly static state. It isn't a coincidence that sitcoms progress their characters so slowly, even if the story is moving along just fine. Progressing characters requires a multitude of new ideas to come into existence within the series, which would disrupt the main intention of the genre, being slow, comedic, and an overall relaxing experience. The reason sitcoms are able to work so well with so few ideas is due to the attachment that we're easily able to establish with these characters. Due to their static nature and slow, easy-to-follow progression, it becomes very easy to get to know these characters inside and out and to sympathize with them. And so the main draw of something like a sitcom is the different scenarios in which we're able to see these characters that we know all so well react to a certain situation. And also the comedy, of course. This formula implemented by sitcoms will eventually lead the show to a similar place as Pong, suffering a similar fault. The Seinfeld effect is quite well known at this point, and while I never had the chance to grow up with Seinfeld, it is quite easy to see what's going on and why it happened. Going back to watch Seinfeld now, after all the furtherance in the genre and the new ideas that have been implemented since Seinfeld stopped airing, it's not as enjoyable as I'm sure it was back then when it first started. I can say in retrospect that it seems Seinfeld was definitely a step up from anything in the genre that had come before it, but the quality of shows in that genre have improved since then, and so Seinfeld is no longer king. An epic drama, on the other hand, has much more apparent keys to success, as many of the things that make such a show good we've already talked about here. An epic drama simply has a greater number of ideas, a comparatively fast-moving plot, changing character motivations, twists and turns, highly emotional moments, and the like. There's a lot going on in a show like this, and it can easily become a roller coaster ride of events and emotions if done correctly. A show like this does not necessarily have more thought put into it than Seinfeld does, it is just allocated differently. Much of the effort that Seinfeld puts into its comedy could be allocated to creating a gripping story which these dramas go for, with varying degrees of success of course. This all, of course, does not mean that Seinfeld is a great show or that the sitcom formula is bad. They are both clearly good. The formula is simply limiting to a certain degree. Bringing it full circle, in the case of Shadow of the Colossus, it is very easy to see that it has much more going on than Pong. It's clearly a much more complex game, and it certainly has many more ideas. The quality of ideas, in contrast to the number of ideas in a work, is a much more subjective concept. It is fairly easy to discern which between two things contains a greater number of ideas just by observing them. However, the quality of each of those ideas is not so tangible. Diving into this topic too in-depthly would require an entirely different video to discuss the whole objectivity versus subjectivity debate, so we'll leave that one for another day. The important thing to take away is that while the number of ideas is mostly objective, the quality of ideas is much more difficult to pin down. There is mainly a general idea of the quality accepted by a majority of people, but there are still definitely people who do not conform to that idea of quality. And so we come to the big question. How did Shadow of the Colossus manage to have more and generally better ideas than Pong? The first part of that question is rather simple to answer. The creators of Shadow of the Colossus simply had more to work with given the technology differences, years of video game history behind them, and certainly they had a much larger team and budget. So that explains the capacity to implement so many ideas into the game, but how did they manage to achieve so much of that potential? Going back to my first video about Shadow of the Colossus, it was simply the ambition that the team had and the amazing attention to detail that they put into the game. With this attention to detail, they were able to densely pack all kinds of ideas into this relatively short experience. Shadow of the Colossus may not have the gripping narrative of an epic drama, but the ideas are found elsewhere. The Colossi themselves and the environments in which they are found are brimming with ideas. The world especially does a great job of communicating all these ideas to the player through its design and interesting environments. That's not to say that's the only place where these ideas were hidden into the game. Wander himself definitely has a lot of ideas implemented into him, going back to his deterioration and also the interesting way that he moves around. That answers the question of the number of ideas, so how about the quality of ideas? The few ideas the Pong does have are fairly simple in nature. There's not much going on with them and they are easy to comprehend. Shadow of the Colossus, on the other hand, goes for much more interesting ideas that are varying in degrees of subtlety and comprehensiveness. The idea of climbing a giant monster in order to stab it so that it eventually dies is inherently a much more interesting idea than moving a rectangle up and down in order to hit a circle moving towards you. Shadow of the Colossus is loaded with ideas equally as intriguing everywhere to be seen, which improves its quality of ideas, while Pong has a few basic concepts that can be understood in a couple seconds. It's not just the intrigue that determines the quality of an idea, however. Shadow of the Colossus also implements ideas because they are entertaining, such as climbing the colossi, or because they are nice little details that add to the whole experience, like being able to grip onto the birds. Point is, there are numerous factors that can be used to determine the quality of an idea. Shadow of the Colossus has plenty of ideas, and as previously discussed, adding new ideas is always a big risk because they must be good and must be implemented well into the work. This is where perfection comes in. While I don't think Shadow of the Colossus to be a perfect game, I do think it generally handled its ideas very well. I believe the vast majority of ideas were handled at least satisfactory, which is a great accomplishment due to the number and complexity of ideas that it presents. It could have easily failed in many of the ideas it was trying to present if it was handled with any less care than it was. The whole game was a big risk from the developer's perspective, but it was important that it was, because if it wasn't risky, it could never have reached the heights that it did, regardless of who was making it. This is the importance of risk-taking, and it comes right back around to the concept that the work can expand its potential quality by introducing more ideas into the mix. Shadow of the Colossus clearly understands this concept due to the number of ideas it introduces and then how it chooses to handle those ideas. This also connects directly to the ambition found in the game that only adds to this potential quality, as completely new ideas found nowhere else are inherently more interesting than ideas we've seen before. Pong and Shadow of the Colossus very clearly illustrate the issue with perfection in my mind. In virtually all cases, if something is able to achieve perfection, then that thing was probably not ambitious enough or did not introduce enough good ideas. In Pong's case, it was more of a technological limitation that prevented any more ideas from being implemented, and so Pong is not so much at fault, but the point still stands. If only that thing had done so, it could have greatly expanded its overall potential, and with the right amount of execution, could have easily surpassed the finished quality of the perfect version. Many people say that they value the perfection of something to be the ultimate goal, but I believe what they are really saying is they want an interesting idea to be executed to a very high degree. We do not simply want something to be perfect, because as previously stated, perfection alone is not interesting. Risk-taking is inherently interesting, and is certainly a very important part of just about any medium, and perfection definitely isn't perfect. Hey guys, Mitopphic here. Thanks for making it all the way through the video, and leave a comment down below if you feel so inclined. Alright, until next time, I'll see you later.